This is part two to the Ontario Apple IPM workshop series, Fire Blight, Nectaria, Phytophthora, and Rust. My name is Christy Greg McGuffin. I'm a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs. In this series, we're going to be talking about insects and disease common in Ontario apple orchards, from their identification and biology, how to monitor for them, as well as cover some general management practices.
Fire blight can be quite a devastating disease in Ontario apple orchards. Unfortunately, this bacteria is ubiquitous within an orchard. In other words, it's always present and has quite an extensive host range outside of apple and pear. These alternative hosts can act as reservoirs then for the inoculum. However, the risk of infection varies year to year, and that depends on environmental factors, management practices, and the overall tree health. So the fire blight pathogen can actually attack many different parts of the tree, and the symptoms are also often referred to by the part of the tree which is attacked. So for example, blossom, shoot, fruit, limb, or rootstock blight. In the next slides, I'm going to talk about each individual part of the tree and how these symptoms are expressed. So blossom blight is typically the first infection that's seen in the orchard in a year. This is the most susceptible stage as the flowers provide a natural opening for the bacteria to enter. At first, these blossoms appear water-soaked, but eventually they begin to wilt, shrivel, turn brown or black, and they'll often stay attached onto the tree. The pathogen can then progress down into the flower stem, through the spur, and eventually it can also enter into the branch or the shoot. So in these pictures, you can see in the top right corner, this wilting of the blossom as that infection starts to spread through the tree. And you can see the stems starting to darken in both the leaves as well as the flower stems. And this will spread eventually into the limb itself. Shortly after infection, you can start seeing ooze start to develop, especially during humid or wet conditions. You can see these ooze droplets developing on the infected blossoms. And with time, that can spread, as you can see in this bottom right corner, this can spread down the shoot, eventually affecting the leaves surrounding that blossom. The brown dieback can start to happen at the edge of the leaf and then eventually start to spread and cover the whole area. Fruit blight, though, however, this can happen throughout the season. It's not just that developing fruitlet as the blossom infection occurs. So fruit blight can also occur by trauma blight during the season, either by damage through insect, high winds, especially in areas that have very sandy soils, or it can also happen following a hail event. So symptoms typically appear about a day or two after the wounding event occurs. They usually start quite water soaked initially, but these lesions can start to become dark brown, rotten spread across the fruit, and you'll often see bacterial ooze droplets that start to come from that. Now, as that disease progresses, then the fruit often becomes quite shriveled, as you can see in the picture here of pear. It can be quite shriveled and it remains attached to that spur. Now, shoot blight can occur either through the spread from blossom blight, or it can occur on a separate basis as well. So this occurs on the succulent shoots or on suckers. And at first, similar to the fruit infection, it can occur water soaked, but it eventually starts to turn brown black, looking almost as though someone has set fire to the shoot. It develops this really characteristic curve or bend within the shoot, also known as a shepherd's crook or an inverted J. And these dead leaves will actually remain on the shoot throughout the season and into the winter. So it can make determining where this infection is, where shoot infection is, rather easy through dormant pruning when you can see these leaves still remaining on the tree. So as I said, it can be spread through blossom blight, but it can also happen individually too, on an individual basis, coming from active cankers as well. This infection can occur in shoots coming from active cankers. And depending on the severity of the shoot infection on the trees can actually look almost as though they're fire scorched, or as though someone set fire to those trees with the number of shoots that can be affected. Now, when it comes to shoot blight, there are some other culprits within an orchard that could cause something similar. And it's important to identify the differences because the management programs will be very different. So the picture on the left you can see is a characteristic fire blight, shoot blight infection with this shepherd's crook or inverted J that's happening here. The picture on the right, though, is an image of flagging that can occur from oriental fruit moth tunneling. So the larva actually tunnels into that succulent new shoot and develops inside in this woody area. And so what you can look for to tell the difference is that with oriental fruit moth, there will be the presence of an entry hole, and oftentimes there's presence of brown frass around that entry hole as well. If you open this up, there's possibility that you may be able to see the larva develop, depending on if it's finished its cycle in that limb at the point. So canker blight, I've mentioned cankers a couple times, and this is when the fire blight pathogen can infect the limb or the trunk of the tree. And this appears as a dark, sometimes purple spot. It can be water soaked, but eventually starts to become a rather dry looking area. The margins can become raised and cracked as the disease progresses, and the tree begins to kind of compartmentalize the bacteria within a certain area. So you get these quite cracked, round areas, and the spread begins to slow eventually as the season progresses. So lastly, another part of the tree that can be infected is rootstock. There are certain rootstocks, particularly those that are grown in Ontario, that are particularly susceptible, especially those that are prone to root suckering. So they can include things like B9, M9, M26 in particular, though there are other susceptible rootstocks around. And so this infection can occur either through wounds, whether that's mechanical, say something hitting it and causing a wound, or by insects, for instance, through a borer of some kind. It can also enter in through the rootstock suckers. So again, those rootstocks that are prone to suckering tend to be more susceptible to rootstock blight. Now, unfortunately, with rootstock blight, it almost always results in tree mortality. And in fact, with young trees, infection of blossom blight can actually spread to the roots in under a month in ideal conditions. So it can really cause death of a tree very quickly, depending on the age of the tree. So I've also mentioned ooze a couple of times, and I just wanted to bring up why this is so important. This has been work that's come out of Michigan State University, and they've looked at how much bacteria is actually within a single ooze droplet. And when I say a single ooze droplet, you can see from this picture, I'm meaning just those individual droplets. Each one of those droplets can contain approximately 1 billion cells. And to cause a fire blight infection will only take a couple hundred. So to think about a single ooze droplet, there's the potential there to infect every shoot in the orchard if these cells can be spread. So it can be spread by rain, by wind, by insects, by contaminated clothing or equipment. Think of a fly landing on that droplet and how easy it would be for that fly to spread thousands of cells from place to place with the amount of landing that it does on all of the plant tissue. So in terms of the biology of fire blight, it overwinters at the edge of the cankers. So the bacteria actually moves right to that what's known as transition zone, and that's that area between the healthy and the unhealthy tissue. And that's where the bacteria is found. And as the temperatures start to warm up in the spring, in other words, as it starts to get above about 18 degrees, then that bacteria starts to become active within the tree, and you start to see ooze coming from those cankers. And during times of rain, or any types of water, whether it's spray water as well, this is splashed or carried by insects then to blossoms and shoots. And so that's how the initial infection happens in the season from these overwintering cankers. And so the bacteria can actually grow and multiply on any surface once it lands there. So it can continue to grow even if there isn't necessarily a wound for it to enter the tree, it can still continue to develop on the surface. Once there's free moisture, so again, if it's a rain event, if there's heavy dew, if you use overhead irrigation, or even if you're going through with a scab spray, there's a possibility that this moisture can move the bacteria then down into the flower if it's not protected. So it's possible as well that infection may not necessarily occur immediately after that bacteria has entered in. So in unfavorable conditions, it can actually colonize the leaves and flower parts without actually causing any sort of disease symptoms. So the bacteria itself is capable of growing in a wide range of temperatures, anywhere from about 4 degrees to 32 degrees. But it really has rapid multiplication where it can go from a few to millions within a short period of time between temperatures of about 24 and 29 degrees. So if infection is present in the orchard, then secondary infection can occur throughout the entire growing season, and it can spread from either those infected blossoms or from oozing cankers and infect those developing succulent shoots. All those need are tiny microscopic wounds. So anything that can happen through high winds, through hail, through heavy rains, as well as by wounds made by insects, or can be spread throughout contaminated equipment, say going through and doing some summer pruning. So this disease then spreads to all of those succulent shoots and progresses slowly into the tree. With that active growth, it moves faster. As the tree begins to shut down at dormancy, then the disease progresses less. So the more growth there is, the faster the disease will progress through the tree, which is why it's so easy to kill such young trees because of that active growth. So with the management of fire blight, it's important to know that sometimes visual observations are not enough, depending on what it is that you're seeing. So with this limb dieback, or sometimes you can see entire tree collapse with rootstock fire blight, there can sometimes be other culprits in the orchard that can cause very similar symptoms. So looking at this slide here, can you find which one is actually caused by fire blight? So the first imposter is Phytophthora root rot. So this is actually a soil-borne water mold. So it lives within the soil and affects the roots of the tree, and it can cause tree collapse in stressed or young trees. Healthy, strong, well-established trees often do not experience any symptoms. It's when you're dealing with newly planted trees or any trees that are undergoing some kind of environmental stress or nutritional stress will experience infection. So symptoms are often these reddish orange cankers that can occur at the roots and along the crown. The margins are very distinct between that unhealthy and healthy tissue. And unfortunately, once a tree is infected, there is no management that's available for bearing trees. So instead, the management is proactive basis. So it's selecting well-drained orchard sites, also planting resistant rootstocks that are available, and considering trying to reduce moisture buildup around the base of the tree, either by removing extended use of tree guards or by making sure that they're clean of any sort of debris that might be falling in, and also making sure that there's no weed or grass development around the base of the tree that could be holding some moisture in the area. However, for non-bearing trees, there are preventative sprays that are available for use of this disease. So now there's one more imposter that's here in this group, and it's known as Nectary twig blight. And so this actually invades old injuries, and this can be things like old fire blight cankers, but very commonly it invades in old pruning cuts or winter injury. Now, this is not as aggressive as something like fire blight. It can girdle large limbs, but oftentimes you can prune out this limb dieback without having any sort of impact on the rest of the tree. It can look very similar to fire blight in terms of its limb dieback and the appearance on the shoots. However, What does set this apart is the appearance of these bright orange spore cushions that often come out in during times of humid or wet weather, when the pathogen is actively sporulating. So presence of these cushions indicates presence of Nectary twig blight. So all this is said because it's very important to stress that visual observations are sometimes not enough. If you're seeing signs um, of limb dieback or tree collapse, it's suggested that you do send a sample of the diseased tissue to a pest diagnostic lab for accurate identification before you make any sort of management decisions. Because unfortunately, this could be a very expensive mistake if it's misidentified. So in terms of fire blight management and monitoring, know when and where to look for symptoms and for what. So during dormant times, you're looking for overwintering cankers. In the spring, those cankers are starting to ooze. You're also looking for signs of infected blossoms and shoots. During the summer and fall, you're looking at, again, for that shoot blight, any sort of trauma blight that may occur, as well as signs of canker and rootstock blight. Monitor precipitation, temperature, and growth, especially in susceptible varieties. And you can actually use decision support models to determine infection events. Two very common models that are used for fire blight is the Mary blight or the cougar blight models. And these are available for download. It is advised to use these for your own orchard. Having this orchard specific model running will give you a more accurate prediction in terms of infection events. But if you don't have access to these models or to weather data, then you can also use our OMAFRA provided prediction maps. This is just a snapshot of what these look like. These are animated maps that provide predictions over a 7-day period. And this looks at the areas within southwestern Ontario, giving an indication in terms of the level of risk for each day over that 7-day period. And you can use this as a decision-making guide to just help base whether or not, given the forecasted weather within your area and what's being predicted on this map, whether a control measure is needed in your block. So when it comes to fire blight, cultural control really is the first line of defense. So consider your susceptibility within both the cultivar as well as the rootstock in which you're planting or which you have in the orchard. And then thinking about pruning out infected tissue that's both during the dormant time as well as during dry conditions in season. The best thing you can do is get that tissue out of the orchard. So prune during dry conditions. If it's going to be dry for the next few days, which is ideal for pruning conditions, leave it within the row middle and then either remove from the orchard after it's had a period of time to dry or go through and mulch those pruning cuts down through the center. The picture here on the left is an image of a shoot, an infected shoot. And I just have a number of arrows here in terms of helping with identifying where to prune on the tree. So this first arrow here at the top of the shoot, this is a dead part of the shoot. So there is no active bacteria within this area. Where the bacteria is residing is down here at the transition zone of where the second arrow is pointing. So the transition zone between the unhealthy tissue and the healthy tissue is where that bacteria is going to be present. Now, if you go here and prune at this area, what you're going to be doing is not only not getting the bacteria that will then spread further down the shoot, but you're also contaminating your equipment, and there's the potential of spread throughout the orchard if you don't disinfect between cuts. Where you do want to target your cut is down at the bottom arrow, at least 30 centimeters away from that transition zone, or if possible into the second year wood. Having that cut will help ensure that you don't have the presence of the bacteria within that area and you're removing all of that shoot infection. So another way to help try and control fire blight spread within the orchard is to try and avoid excessive succulent growth. They love that succulent tissue. The bacteria spreads faster in active growth. So limit the use of nitrogen, as well as consider the use of apogee to help prevent that extended shoot growth. Also, in order to prevent rootstock blight, then consider removing root suckers as much as possible, as those are going to be the entry zone, either for insect damage as well as for any sort of trauma that could occur and allow entry for the bacteria. Chemical controls, the best first step is to look at use of dormant copper. That's going to be targeting those overwintering cankers and limiting any sort of ooze and spread that may happen with the bacteria coming out of those cankers. During the blossom time, though, is considering the use of biologicals and bactericides. And this is especially during conditions either predicted through the use of forecasting models, or if not using models, then if temperatures are above 18 degrees with high humidity, heavy dews, or rainfall, or again, if you're going through with a scab spray, then consider having some sort of control product in place to protect against fire blight. Throughout the season, then also consider maintaining good insect control, because this can lead to either the transmission of the bacteria, it can also cause entry sites for that bacteria to enter into the tree. So changing to another area, we're going to talk about rust diseases now. Two main types of rust disease in Ontario are cedar apple rust and quince rust. Now, the interesting thing about rust is that they actually require alternate hosts to complete their cycle. So they have a winter host, which are often various varieties of cedar and juniper, and then they have a summer host as well. So looking particularly at cedar apple rust, this overwinters as galls on the alternate host. And during the early spring, then these galls start to become active, especially during wet and humid conditions. And so the galls actually produce these quite alien-like orange gelatinous teleohorns. And from these, spores are produced and released in through wind currents. And so these can be present for a few days up to several weeks, depending on what the weather's like. So those spores then, you can see in the bottom left corner is presence of an overwintering gall. And then that produces those teleohorns, which release the spores. The spores are then windborne and land on the apple tissue, whether that's the leaf or the developing fruit. And that's what then triggers infection on the apple. So the apple carries through and follows the similar infection period. So the spores are produced, those are released, and they infect the alternate host. And that develops the galls, which then overwinter on the alternate host throughout the winter time. So in terms of symptoms on the apples themselves, with the leaf development, these are quite distinct lesions that develop. They're quite a vibrant yellow-orange color that develops on the upper surface of the leaf. And oftentimes then as the lesion progresses, then you develop this small black spot in the center of the lesion. So from this lesion on the underside of the leaf, you start to see these tube-like projections that extend out. And from that, then these powdery-like spores are spread by the wind. And so again, those spores are what then affects the alternate host, which then overwinters and produces inoculum in the apples for the following year. So lesions can also develop on the fruit as well. Because the spores from the alternate hosts are being released in that early season, then you typically see these lesions develop along the calyx, because it's on that early developing fruitlet stage that the infection occurs. So the coloration is very similar to what happens on the leaves. You get this yellow to orange discoloration. You can also see the presence of the structures, those tube-like structures that extend when they're actively sporulating. And the fruit continues to grow oftentimes with these lesions. So what can happen is you get these quite distorted fruit that develop as it grows around those lesions. So it's not uncommon to mistake these infections for others that are present in the orchard. Sometimes pictures are very different from what you're actually seeing in the field. When it comes to cedar apple rust on the fruit, it can be mistaken for apple scab. With cedar apple rust, you often see that yellow to orange halo that surrounds the lesion. And again, oftentimes you see those tube-like structures that protrude, so it's quite a bumpy appearance. Whereas scab is this dark brown, often corky or scabby lesion on the surface. In terms of the lesions or symptoms on the leaves, it's quite different between the two, with cedar apple rust being that bright orange yellow lesions as opposed to the brown to olive green lesions with apple scab. The leaf symptoms, though, can be mistaken with frog eye leaf spot. So again, though, with cedar apple rust, bright orange lesions often with black spots in the middle, as opposed to frog eye leaf spot, which I'll talk about in another part to this webinar series. It has the dark brown circle. It's a small dark brown circle with a light tan center. So very similar to the appearance of a frog eye. So Quince rust, in terms of its cycle, it's very similar to cedar apple rust. The overwintering galls on the alternate hosts, they form these gelatinous spores in the early season and release these spores through wind. So the difference, though, between quince and cedar apple rust is that quince does not actually cause lesions on the apple leaves. So with quince rust, you're only seeing fruit symptoms. And this develops, again, similar to cedar apple rust on the calyx end of the fruit because of that early season infection that occurs. And then you'll be able to see oftentimes those tube-like structures that extend from the lesions. So while it is possible for these spores to be windborne for a number of kilometers, most infections tend to happen when the alternate host is within a near vicinity to the orchard. And because that alternate host releases its spores early season, then infection of the apples actually occurs within that tight cluster to petal fall timing, and in particular during warm, wet weather. It doesn't require a long period for infection. It also doesn't require really hot temperature in order for infection to occur, but under longer wetting periods, you do get particularly damaging infection events. And it's important to know that infection does not spread from apple to apple or from alternate host to alternate host. It needs to have the two in order to complete its cycle. So the infections that you see this year are coming from alternate hosts, and those spores need to infect that alternate host once more in order for the cycle to continue. So it's not going to be spread from one apple tree or fruit to another. In terms of monitoring, there are susceptible varieties to rust, in particular Empire, Golden Delicious, Matsu, Northern Spy, Red Delicious, and Russet. And it's also important when you're monitoring to know what's in the area, what is adjacent to the orchard in both hedgerows, if you can see anything within a woodlot, or if there's anything. A lot of times junipers are common in landscape, and so if you're around any sort of residential area, if there's any sort of potential source that could be in that area too. In terms of cultural controls, there are varieties that are known to be resistant to rust. However, the best control option is to remove alternate hosts as much as possible. Where you know that where there are alternate hosts available, especially in the hedgerows on your farm, if it's possible to remove those, then you are breaking that potential cycle that can occur. If, however, there is no way of being able to get rid of those alternate hosts, chemical controls are available. There are many fungicides that are registered for scab control that do give good rust control as well. Where you know that there is pressure, then that timing would be during that tight cluster to petal fall to really target the rust activity. So that brings us to the end. If you're interested in more information, there are some resources available. You can go to the Apple module within our Ontario Crop IPM website. That information is also available within our publication 310, Integrated Pest Management for Apples. Another excellent resource to refer to is the Compendium of Apple and Pear Diseases and Pests. And with that, I thank you for joining me. My contact information is available on the slide should you need to reach out to me for any comments or questions. I also encourage you to subscribe to our fruit blog at onfruit.ca for all timely information on Ontario fruit production.